And tonight, conspiracy to defraud the United States. That's one of 4 new federal counts former President Donald Trump has just been charged with. And this is now the 3rd time the former president has been indicted, the 2nd time by the same special prosecutor who the former president has been attacking online, calling deranged and insisting that all of these cases against him are politically motivated witch hunts. Now, this latest indictment is in relation to Trump's alleged role in 2020 election interference, and it is a 45-page indictment. And in it, the government lays out some of their case for those 4 counts: conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. We're going to get into all of that and what those mean in just a moment. But here's what Special Counsel Jack Smith said today, moments after the indictment was unsealed.
The attack on our nation's capital on January 6th, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election.
Now, word of this indictment has been looming for weeks after Trump said he had received a target letter from the Department of Justice. And even today, just minutes before his official indictment was handed down, the former president took to Truth Social announcing that he was about to be indicted. And let's bring in NBC senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, Attorney General Merrick Garland is calling this the largest investigation in our history. Let's take a quick listen.
The career men and women of the Justice Department engaged in what has become the largest investigation in our history. Mr. Smith and his team of experienced principal career agents and prosecutors have followed the facts and the law wherever they lead.
Now, Hallie, I've been watching you live on television, reading through this indictment, making some analysis. What are your biggest takeaways from this 45-page indictment here?
Well, I think if there is one that I hope sticks with people, or that people are wondering what should stick with them, there would be one takeaway here. And Gadi, that is the sort of basis that connects all of these different strings. I think it's, listen, I live and breathe this all the time here in Washington. We talk about fake electors. We talk about the Capitol attack. We talk about various pieces of what's reflected in this indictment, which I think can be shorthand that sometimes, isn't so relevant to folks at home. But here's what I would say. The connective tissue for all of this is the lies that Donald Trump pushed about the 2020 election. And they are lies, as this indictment very clearly lays out. There had been this question, there had been this discussion of, well, what was the former president's intent when he made these claims that turned out not to be true, that the election was stolen? He said that again and again. It turns out this indictment lays out he was told over and over and over, in some cases directly, as the indictment says, that what he was saying was not true, that there was no widespread fraud in the election, that he acknowledged that, and yet he persisted in the lie that is the sort of foundation of this claim that, in fact, the 2020 election had been taken from him illegitimately. Again, that wasn't the case. That wasn't true. There was no evidence of widespread fraud. That, to me, I think it's laid out fairly early on in this 45-page indictment. I think it's on page 7 or page 8. And that is the foundation through which is the lens for everything else to be seen here, Gadi.
Hallie, on page 7, page 8, it is people telling him, no, this is incorrect. No, this is incorrect. And yet, reading this, I keep hearing Kellyanne Conway and that moment of alternative facts when that idea was presented, remember? And, I also have been pouring through this, and I cannot find a single moment in which he says, yeah, I know that is fraud, or yeah, I know that is incorrect, but let's find it anyway. And that would be somewhat of a smoking gun. And so part of me is wondering, did he believe all of these things that we know not to be true? And if he did, in fact, believe these untruths, is that a legal case?
Yeah, that's, I think, what prosecutors are going to have to lay out here, and I'm sure legal experts will want to opine on that piece of it as well. What is clear are the facts of the matter, right? Because what we know is what people said to Donald Trump, what Donald Trump said to others, and what the people around him, these unindicted co-conspirators, were doing and saying at the time as well. We have already seen some glimmers of the legal case that perhaps the former president's attorneys will try to put forward. One of them was just out on Fox News not too long ago, essentially saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, this is not a direct quote, but that the former president was the chief executive of the country doing sort of what he felt he needed to as a public policy matter. The prosecution, on the other hand, is saying and laying out this case where it says, no, this was criminal. This was illegal. This was in defiance of U.S. code. I think big picture and stepping back, this is the first time that we have seen a former president and somebody who is currently running to be president again, charged federally with a crime, accused of seeking to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another. That is such a democratic bedrock of this country, Gadi. Like, we learn about that in social studies all across the country, right? Like, kids learn about that when they're talking about, you know, the way that the Constitution works and the way that democracy works. And I think that is what the prosecution is, as you heard Jack Smith lay out, what they are seeking to prove here.
And we're also waiting to hear on what comes out with this investigation in Georgia. There's also this arraignment in Florida on August 10th. This is happening in so many different directions at the same time. What's the Trump campaign saying?
And by the way, Gadi, the collision of the first Republican presidential primary debate coming up at the end of August, or just a few weeks here. Now, it's not likely that Donald Trump will participate in that, but you talk about sort of the legal and the political being on a collision course. That is what we're seeing. The timing of this is so interesting. You point out that that the sort of court dates that are going to happen over the next few weeks. I think the big one that is still a question mark, we know it'll happen sometime before September 1st, based on what the district attorney has said, but it's happening down in Fulton County, Georgia, right? This is the case. It's very similar as far as the investigatory matter, the scheme to overturn the election in the state of Georgia, right? So tonight, this was a federal indictment. The one that's going to come in Georgia potentially is a state level. The district attorney will announce whether or not she is going to charge Donald Trump. That could come like in the next 2 to 3 weeks, Gadi, right? So not only are we talking about a former president who now is facing his third indictment, he's been charged with his third indictment, there could even be a fourth indictment sometime before the summer ends. And I think that as it overlays with the political calendar is part of what is so significant here, because you look at the numbers, right? I mean, we are just now getting to be 5 months away from the Iowa caucuses that will happen in early 2024. So it's all on a collision course. It's what we're going to be talking about for the next year of our lives, maybe longer, right, depending on how the primary goes, Gadi. And that is why it is just sort of a moment to sort of sit back, look at the big picture, and understand the significance of what's going down. Now, Republicans will say this is not significant. They'll say it's significant for other reasons, that they believe, allies of the former president, it's political persecution against him. And that is going to be a line that we're also going to hear, I think, for months to come.
Looking at the big picture, that's what you do best. Hallie Jackson, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And let's now bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. Danny, you've been going through this indictment. What stands out to you the most here from a defense attorney's perspective?
That's the question, because for me, what I've thought about throughout a potential Trump indictment in connection with January 6th is really the narrowing scope of a defense, and it would have to revolve around some form of ignorance. Now, it's true that ignorance of the law is generally not a defense to a crime, but ignorance can go to intent. So in this case, for example, Trump might argue as to really all of these crimes that he doesn't have the requisite intent. Why? Because he believed, he actually and truly believed that he won the election and that there was something nefarious afoot preventing him from winning that election. So that is what I was looking for in any indictment of Donald Trump related to January 6th. And the DOJ, Jack Smith's team, responded. They have an entire section on the different important and knowledgeable people who told Donald Trump that he had lost the election and that there was nothing nefarious going on with the election as conducted. Those include senior members of the DOJ. Those include other people, consultants, people who would know, including the courts, by the way. And most of these, there's a list that appears at page 7, I believe, of the indictment that goes through that. So to me, that was the most significant thing I was looking for, even though factually, when you read this indictment, there isn't anything surprising. Why? Because of the January 6th committee last summer, because of the impeachment of Donald Trump. much of the facts in here we had some awareness of. And certainly by last year, when the January 6th committee did their investigation, much of this has already been out there. So not a lot in the way of surprises. Maybe if there's any surprise, it's that there are named unindicted co-conspirators who are actually, I should say, not named, but that they were not charged, which represents or tells me that that Jack Smith's team wants to keep this simple. They want to go after the target, and the target is the former president, Donald Trump.
And let's say at home, you've got the indictment on your phone out, and you were just talking about that section. I think I found it. It's on page 6, the defendant's knowledge of the falsity of his election fraud claim. To me, that is the center of all of this, too. And the indictment, like you said, straight out says that Trump lied. It says, quote, he widely disseminated his false claims of election fraud for months, despite the fact that he knew in many cases had been informed directly that they were not true. Okay, so Danny, just like what you were saying, in this indictment, I am struggling to find the exact spot that says that he did know otherwise. There are a lot of points in which he's told, like you were just saying, that he was told otherwise or told, no, Mr. President, those reports of voter fraud were wrong by those that were closest to him. But we've covered him for a long time, and there is a big difference between someone being told something and someone believing that's true. So I know that's getting into semantics, but if Trump continues to... So, yeah, the point being, if he's insisting over and over again, never drops character, and truly, truly believes, I won, everything's a witch hunt, they are lying, and he convinces a jury that that's how he sees it, is that protected speech?
If criminal defense attorneys were able to tell you the conversations with their clients, they would tell you that that line of thinking has been a staple of white-collar criminal defense or defendants' thinking since time immemorial. And by that, I mean this. Oftentimes, a defense attorney will get a client that comes in and says, sure, there are 50 different people who told me something. Sure, there are 100 emails telling me one thing. Sure, I looked out the window and saw what was there to be seen. But nobody can prove what I actually thought in my mind. Well, guess what? Prosecutors have a solution for that. And if that's your defense, if your defense is 80 people told me one fact, A, and I simply believe in my heart of hearts that fact B is the truth, the government and prosecutors, they say, no problem. If that's your defense, great. Then what we'll do, you can pitch it to a jury. We'll march 14 different witnesses in, and those witnesses will tell you will testify what they told you, why they told it to you, the basis of their information, and you have two options. You can either send your lawyer up to the podium at the end of your case to point at all those witnesses and say, they lying, or you can get up and take the stand and tell the jury yourself. In the face of everything these people told me, I still believe that I was right. And prosecutors will say, go right ahead. There you go. And so you're absolutely right, Gadi. That is a theory that criminal defendants have floated since the beginning of time. The reality is it doesn't work because eventually common sense involves itself in a jury trial. And if you can't sell that to a jury, and I don't know that you could with all of these facts, then it's not going to fly.
One more very ignorant question, but the thing that may be different this time is that in this world of alternative facts, there was so much disinformation and so many fake news articles that were out there talking about this fraud. And so I'm wondering, from a defense perspective, if those things started to be introduced into a case and then all of a sudden you just had fake news article, hey, see, look, this news article said this, and then they have to spend time going back and explaining the reporting behind that and who was involved. And it's just time. It seems like a big time suck, and it seems like such a clear way to confuse a jury or to at least cloud the courtroom. Could that be a part of the defense?
Gadi, I don't think that's an ignorant question at all. I think you're spot on. I mean, everything about this case is Trump's state of mind. And so we really should be focusing on the evidence that goes to state of mind. Yes, I mean, all the false electors and the facts and how that scheme was allegedly carried out, that's all critically important. But at the end of the day, the only real central theme of this case is Trump's only defense, which is his state of mind. So you're absolutely right. The government has to anticipate that Trump may try to introduce evidence, and he might have some problems introducing it because if he wants to introduce what was actually in his mind, there's not too many ways to do that unless he takes the stand. But if he wants to show that out there in the blogosphere or out there in the ether was all this information that he was digesting, well, he's going to have to show that he digested it, not simply that it was out there on the, I don't know, in the deep, dark web. They're going to have to show that he was aware of it and he digested it and he believed it. And then he's still going to have to sell that belief was reasonable. Now, he doesn't have the burden of proof on anything, but let's get real. The defense sometimes does have the implicit burden of proof after the prosecution has marched in dozens of witnesses that will testify. I told him this, and he seemed like he got it.
I can foresee a future in which a lot of all caps tweets are going to be introduced into evidence. Danny Savalos, thank you so much, brother. And there were a few times President Trump made false statements and allegations about the 2020 election in the days, months, and years following the election. Here's just a few.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. We were winning in all the key locations by a lot, actually. And then our numbers started miraculously getting whittled away in secret. It's a very tough period of time. There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election. They rigged the presidential election of 2020. We're not going to allow them to rig the presidential election of 2024.
And that last clip was literally from just a few days ago. And during those speeches, especially in the last few months, Trump has taken a lot of swings at President Joe Biden, calling him crooked, saying that he has weaponized the Justice Department. So we want to check in with NBC's Mike Mimley on what the president's reaction might be. And Mike, man, I got to start with this. On this contentious and historic day, did Joe Biden go see Oppenheimer at the movies with his wife?
Gadi, he's sitting in the 7th row of the theater as we speak right now, watching that movie. It's really remarkable, such a split-screen moment, just really jarring how ordinary what the president is up to tonight, dinner and a movie on this extraordinary night. But I'll tell you why it's interesting. The White House, as they're doing what they've done throughout so many of these legal issues, not just involving the former president, but involving the president himself and members of his family, has been a strict no-comment policy. They want to make it clear that there is no comment. There is a firewall between what this president is doing and what his Justice Department, what the special counsel is doing. They don't want to play into Republican attacks that he is perhaps trying to use the Justice Department to go after political opponents. But it is interesting that as the campaign and the White House is yet again today saying they have no comment on this indictment tonight, we might have a chance as the president leaves the theater, that he's with the press pool right now, to take a shouted question, to maybe answer that question. But they went ahead with the plan for the president to go out and be having this ordinary night, on this extraordinary night. He is on vacation throughout this week, Gadi, and so it won't be as we see at the White House where there are multiple opportunities to get these questions to the president. But tonight is certainly a prime opportunity, and we'll see if he does take a question as the night goes on.
Yeah, shouting questions at date night. It is so weird. So much of the rhetoric that's been coming from Trump and basically the entire GOP playing field at this point is that this is all a distraction from the investigation into Hunter Biden, the president's son. I know that they've been saying no comment on Trump. They've also kind of been saying no comment on that as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Even as it was just last week, I was standing outside the courthouse in Delaware where his son was going through that attempt to finalize a plea agreement, of course, with the U.S. attorney in the state of Delaware. And the White House at the time was issuing the same comment they issued when the plea agreement had been first announced, which is that the president is viewing this solely as a father, that he supports his son, that he's proud of his son. Now, his son, of course, was in the headlines again yesterday as a former business associate of his testified before a House committee, one of those Republican-led committees that is going through multiple investigations into various aspects of both the president and his son and his business dealings. And again, the White House responded pretty forcefully to what was coming out of that hearing, which was that Democrats saying that this effort to once again try to smear the president by bringing in his son, associates of his son, was unsuccessful, that the witness in that case, Devin Archer, only proved what the White House has been contending, which is that his father, the president, has not been involved in his son's business activities. But you're going to see this, right? You're going to see Republicans doing everything they can to try to muddy the waters and to try to draw a linkage between what's happening with the former president and what's happening with the president.
And so just looking back here, didn't Biden run on taking on Trump and January 6th specifically? I remember so many ads where that was featured extremely prominently. Do you think that we may at any point here see Biden tackle any of this directly?
Well, I think that's what's so interesting about the non-response today to this indictment to the non-response to the previous indictment, which, of course, had to do with the former president's handling of classified material. They may be the same, but they're very different in this respect. You can understand why the White House, why Biden's team did not want to engage on that topic, of course, beyond just this issue of the firewall, wanting to be seen as independent from what the Justice Department was doing, because the president, of course, himself is under a scrutiny by a different special counsel for his own handling of classified materials dating back to his time as vice president. In this case, you can see, yes, they are saying no comment, but remember how President Biden announced his re-election campaign just a few months ago. The video in which he did so began with scenes from the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. When President Biden was campaigning for Democrats in 2022 in the midterm campaign, remember, he was regularly putting this idea that democracy itself was on the ballot, calling attention to his predecessors' efforts to, and Republican efforts to change election laws around the country to continue to propagate the so-called big lie. So even though they won't comment on this indictment, he will continue to talk about the issues that are underlying it, Gadi.
No one's got a memory like yours. And you know who deserves a date night after a news day like this? You do. Mike Mimile, thanks so much for joining us, brother. And at this point, no one is going to forget that this is not just the former president, but a 2024 presidential candidate, the one leading the pack right now. So let's bring in NBC's Dasha Burns to break down the impact that this could have on the race. Dasha, first off, Mike Pence. He's mentioned quite a bit in this indictment. He's also a 2024 presidential candidate, and he just issued this statement. He says, on January 6th, former President Trump demanded that I choose between him and the Constitution. I chose the Constitution, and I always will. What else is Mike Pence saying, and what else are the rest of the GOP candidates saying at this point?
Yeah, Gadi, the backdrop of the 2024 election and this GOP primary just cannot be ignored, because this is really the focus for former President Trump right now. We've now seen this pattern happen where, as the legal woes mount, the political fight really hardens. And you're right, his former vice president is playing a major role here. Some of the more powerful evidence, some of the more powerful aspects of this indictment are the contemporaneous notes that Mike Pence, we're now learning, took in some of his meetings with the former president. And now he is speaking out. He's commenting on this indictment and really saying that in part of his statement, saying that anyone who puts himself above the Constitution should never be president of the United States, and saying he'll have more to comment on once he reviews the indictment further. But we're also hearing from other candidates like Ron DeSantis, like Vivek Ramaswamy, who are sort of walking that fine line that we've seen with the prior indictments. DeSantis talking about the weaponization of government, saying as president he would replace the FBI director and drain the swamp in Washington. Ramaswamy going so far as to say that he would pardon Trump if he were elected president. And so you have much of the GOP field here still really not breaking from Trump when it comes to the substance of this indictment or any of the others, Gadi.
And just going through this indictment, this is pretty wild, but there are those, it looks like those notes that are mentioned in this indictment, which raises the question, could we see Pence testify against Trump in court while he's also running against Trump during the election?
I mean, there is so much that is unprecedented here. I know it's a word that makes our eyes roll into the back of our heads at this point, but just to have a former vice president running against his former boss, that alone was kind of a historic moment when Pence announced his candidacy. But now to have this same former partnership really break in this way is really something historic and momentous to watch. And so much of this indictment and what happens from here could hinge on what Mike Pence witnessed, Gadi.
Meanwhile, he is raising quite a bit. I mean, this has been a campaign finance bonanza for the Trump campaign, right?
Absolutely.
What do you think is going to happen? We've seen it 2 times so far. This is now the 3rd indictment. What do you think is going to happen going forward?
Well, we've already today seen fundraising emails. We're, likely going to see more of those. This is a moment where, while his lawyers are fighting that legal battle, he's really focused on the politics here, and he knows that this is a moment where his supporters really come to his defense. This is where they rally. This is where they come and they donate. And he has done a really good job of messaging this to say, hey, they're not coming after me. They're coming after you, and I am standing in their way. And this is where he is able to really galvanize that support. Though this is the 3rd time, and Gadi, as I talk to voters, I do sense a little bit of that fatigue. But boy, he really does have this uncanny and completely unique connection with voters that is unlike anything we've seen in the political sphere, Gadi.
Dasha Burns, thanks so much. We've got so much more on this indictment when we come back, so stay tuned. And welcome back to our continuing coverage of a new indictment against Donald Trump. And we are now hearing from former January 6 committee members who are reacting to today's development. Former Republican Representative Adam Kinzinger calling it the beginning of justice. Democrat Representative Pete Aguilar saying no one is above the law. It's important to note, though, that this indictment is not charging Trump with inciting the January 6th insurrection, instead saying he basically exploited it. But let's take a look back at some of what he actually said that day.
Never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about. And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal.
Now, whatever happens going forward with this case in particular is going to rewrite free speech textbooks. Presidential historian Michael Beschloss joins us now to put all of this in perspective. Michael, thanks so much for joining us. Just
pleasure, Gadi.
Overview here. What are your thoughts on today?
Well, my main thought is, and we're learning a lot from the way that this case was constructed by Jack Smith and his team. They were trying to show that Donald Trump tried to take down democracy on the 6th of January. You and I know what is a democracy. It depends on 2 things. You have to have elections that work and that people believe in. You also have to have a rule of law. So what did Donald Trump do on the 6th of January, according to this indictment? He tried to defraud the United States by saying, I really won. This is something that the sacred process of American democracy actually elected me, and I'm being denied this. Jack Smith is saying he didn't really believe that. That was fraud. And the other thing he was doing was he was going to his vice president and saying, even though it's never happened before in the whole history of the country, you as vice president, who are required to certify the electoral votes, I want you just to say that you won't certify them. Now, if the United States, if a grand jury, when this trial is held, doesn't say that presidents are not allowed to do those things, then we're not going to have elections. We're not going to have a rule of law. We're not going to have a democracy. That's what's at stake here, Gadi.
And I think that brings you to your tweet today. You said on Twitter just what our founders dreaded, or X, as it's called now. How does the Constitution address this particular scenario?
Well, what the Constitution does is it says, if presidents misbehave, and of these indictments we've seen so far, here's the first indictment of Trump for something that he did, within his leadership as president. What the Constitution says, if a president does something bad, you impeach him and you convict him and you throw him out. Well, Donald Trump was impeached once as president and once as an ex-president. It had about the same effect as a snowflake falling on the Potomac in the wintertime. Donald Trump is back at his own old stand. He's essentially saying the Constitution cannot stop me, and he's absolutely right. So that's why this trial is so important.
And let's just remember real quick the qualifications to run for president. There are no charges, not even a conviction that would force Trump to drop out of the race, right?
Well, there is some legal thought that a president who has been proven to have waged an insurrection or sedition in the way that Jefferson Davis did, who was not a president, but the president of the so-called Confederacy, which was not a real country, but someone who did that, as other Confederates did, cannot serve in the federal government. So let's say that Donald Trump is elected president next year. I guarantee you there will be that legal fight.
And then there's the question of what about presidential pardons? If Trump is convicted and if he wins re-election, or if they're in the middle of trial still, what would a presidential pardon do there?
Most likely he can pardon himself. He can tell his attorney general, shut down this trial, shut down this case. It's illegal and it's illegitimate. He can do that. That's why I believe that presidents have too much power. And what the founders said is, give presidents power, but make sure you've got a system that makes sure that only presidents of good character who love democracy are going to get elected. Love our founders, love the Constitution, but it's not working.
I would love to know what they are thinking right now. Michael Beschloss,
I can imagine.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Pleasure always, Gadi. Thank you.
Sure. And coming up, firefighters are trying to contain the biggest fire so far this year here in California. But first, you got to see this. I don't know if I love this or I hate it, because the last thing we need today is another argument. But take a look at how this bear is standing. Is that how bears normally stand? Because that looks very much like someone in a bear costume. And over at a zoo in China, people are so confused by sun bears standing up. Look at that. He's just standing there waving at everybody, that they're thinking the same thing. That has to be a human dressed up in a bear costume. But the zoo says, no, really, these are animals, we promise. And maybe they're just very good at standing up. We'll be right back. Hey there, welcome back. And here are some of the other headlines we're watching tonight. A former banker of Alec Murdaugh was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for helping Murdaugh steal millions from clients in a scheme that lasted 8 years. That ex-banker will also have to pay more than $3 million worth of restitution. According to the judge, he tricked children and even people with severe injuries. And Indiana's near-total abortion ban is now in effect. The state's 6 abortion clinics stopped providing the procedure yesterday. The ban is currently being challenged in court. If upheld, that law ends most abortions in Indiana, even in the earliest stages of a pregnancy. And in Florida, you might not need an ACT or an SAT test score to get into some public universities, because they're considering an alternative called the CLT, or Classical Learning Test, which has become popular among Christian schools and conservative political groups. The Florida Board of Governors is expected to vote later this month on whether to accept it for admissions. And Las Vegas police are now looking into this video of Cardi B and a fan getting into it during a recent show. The singer was hit with a drink while on stage, and then she threw her microphone towards the person who threw it. Police say at least one person who was in the crowd has filed a police report for battery. And here in Southern California, a fruit fly that can damage crops has forced an agricultural quarantine. And no, this does not mean people have to stay inside their homes. It just stops the movements of crops in an 80-square-mile area. The fly was likely brought by travelers bringing in uninspected produce into the state. And in court today, lawyers tried to throw out charges for Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. She's the armorer on the Rust set where Alec Baldwin fatally shot the film's cinematographer. It's NBC's Steve Patterson has that story.
Yeah, Gadi, that hearing wrapping up this morning, it was fireworks in court. If maybe you're a legal nerd or expert, for everybody else, this was important information that is pertinent to the sanctity of the case. Today's hearing was all about the defense, Gutierrez's defense team, trying to get essentially all charges against her thrown out. Let me back up. Gutierrez Reed is the armorer on set for Rust. She was the one that was responsible for all weaponry, all ammunition in that weaponry, and any props that may have been weaponry for the movie Rust. And then somehow live ammunition ended up in the chamber of that Colt 45 that was fired on that fateful day. And so that's why there's been so much focus on her mental state over the past weeks and months, including the introduction of a new charge of tampering with evidence. And I say mental state because that tampering charge is not about her moving some of this ammunition or one of those guns. It's about her moving a bag of cocaine that prosecutors say she gave off to somebody after an interview with police when they get involved following the Rust investigation. In other words, that she was reckless on set, that she was drinking, that she was smoking either during or before or after the filming in those days in which that movie was being shot. And the more specific allegation is that she was, quote, likely hungover the day that bullet got loaded into the chamber. So now to fast forward to today, today's hearing was all about the defense saying, you know what, we hear that from the prosecution, and we haven't seen a speck of evidence. There's supposed to be a witness who can testify to this, but the name of that witness was not put out. The identity of that witness was not put out. And so these are, according to the defense, inflammatory statements made by the prosecution that are called extrajudicial, that have gotten out to the media, that makes it so when there is a jury that is selected, that there will ultimately be a tainted jury pool. The prosecution obviously arguing that, look, we're not even at a preliminary hearing at this point, and the judge essentially agreeing, saying that there hasn't even been a jury selected, so how could you taint a jury pool at this time? She's going to let this move forward, let the charges move forward, and so next we could see a preliminary hearing as early as next week, Gadi. So far, none of the defense's requests were granted today, and this will move on. Back to you.
Steve Patterson, thanks so much. And now to the massive wildfires scorching California, now crossing state lines into Nevada. And it's been raging since last Friday. This fire has already burned over 80,000 acres in the Mojave Desert, and that is just northwest of where we are here in L.A. The fire has been fueled by super wet winter conditions and now record heat, and it's already caused flight delays and even fire tornadoes that have been spotted on the ground. NBC's Miguel Almaguer has the details.
Facing an out-of-control blaze in extreme conditions, tonight this is the dangerous firefight for crews in California's Mojave Desert. Remote but exploding in size, the York fire has torn across 80,000 acres, the largest in the country so far this year, now spilling into Nevada.
We were pretty concerned that it could start coming down at us.
As the unusual desert blaze destroys protected Joshua trees and threatens endangered animals.
Just heartbreaking.
The erratic conditions here have created fire-nados, a vortex of swirling flames and smoke. Baking in triple digits, firefighters are battling an inferno while working inside an oven.
It gets really bad. It's hard to breathe.
If the heat wasn't enough, smoke is drifting across 2 states, smothering parts of Las Vegas, where a thick haze triggered flight delays and is impacting air quality.
Yeah, it's humid. It's hot.
For some 43 million today under heat alerts, the conditions outside are stifling. In July, Phoenix averaged nearly 103 degrees, the warmest temp for any U.S. city in any year.
Miguel Almaguer, thanks so much. And the deadly stabbing of a man in New York is now being investigated as a hate crime. The professional dancer and choreographer named O'Shea Sibley was voguing to a Beyonce song at a gas station when a group of guys came up to him and told him to stop. You can see in surveillance footage from the moments right before it happened, some sort of argument broke out between the two groups of men. His friends say Sibley tried to calm things down before he was stabbed in the chest. One friend said Sibley was killed because he was gay.
They murdered him because he was gay, because he stood up for his friends. We may be gay, but we exist. we're not going to live in fear. We're not going to live hiding. Because everybody know, Sherry was always out and loud. But y'all killed him.
NBC's Antonia Hilton has more.
In addition to learning that authorities are now looking for a 17-year-old suspect in connection to the killing of O'Shea Sibley, we're learning more about what happened to the 28-year-old late at night on Saturday. O'Shea and a group of friends were outside of a gas station in Brooklyn dancing, a form of dance called voguing that's popular among LGBTQ people here in New York and around the country, just goofing off when suddenly a group of men allegedly approached and began to hurl anti-LGBTQ slurs at Sibley and the others there and to demand that they stop dancing. That's when, according to his friends, Sibley approached them, tried to stand up for himself and tell them that being gay was not a bad thing. Then he was stabbed and the suspect fled the scene in a black SUV. This killing has sent shockwaves through the LGBTQ communities here in New York and around the nation, as people have been warning of an uptick in this kind of hate and activity across the country. Take a listen to our mayor, Eric Adams, reacting to what's now being investigated as a hate crime.
You have an incident like we saw over the weekend where this young man was experiencing that hate crime and we will find the person responsible. It shakes our confidence. When you have someone that randomly assaults someone because they have a real mental health issue on the streets, it shakes your confidence.
For a few years now, advocates have been warning that the politicization and the debate over LGBTQ people's rights would lead to increased violence and confrontations like this in real life. One organization has been tracking these incidents and says that since June of 2022, there have on average been about 39 anti-LGBTQ protests nationwide every single month. Here in New York, a city known to be welcoming of people of all backgrounds, back in June, which is Pride Month, there were incidents at the Stonewall Monument. People tore down and damaged pride flags, and people are warning that more of this could happen if action isn't taken. And so communities here in New York are eager to hear updates later today and this week from authorities.
Antonia Hilton, thanks so much. And in Wisconsin, we just saw the end of the most expensive judicial election in all of American history. For the first time in 15 years, the state Supreme Court now has a liberal majority, and that's because a new justice was just sworn in, shifting the balance of power in that key battleground state. NBC's Shaq Brewster has the latest.
Well, it is official. For the first time in 15 years, Wisconsin has a liberal majority on its state Supreme Court. Justice Janet Protasiewicz putting her hand on the Bible and swearing into the court earlier this afternoon, saying that her move on the court was an honor of a lifetime. This was a major win for Democrats and progressives in this state back in April when she won a contentious election. This is a court that has been at the center of some really controversial rulings in the past, striking down COVID restrictions, banning the use of drop boxes, siding with Republican-drawn maps in the legislative and redistricting battle. All of those issues could come back before this court in the future. But the one issue that was the center of the election back in April, and that is the center of focus for many voters and Wisconsinites now, is whether or not this court will uphold the existing ban on abortions. That ban that is reflective of an 1849 law that snapped back into effect after the overturning of Roe. It's already working itself through the courts, challenges to that law. That is a case that is expected to come before the Supreme Court in this next term. But there are a slew of issues that we can expect to see, everything from election challenges, as we saw in previous presidential elections, to even what the law will look like, what election law will look like in this state, from drop boxes to absentee voting. A lot of action expected to take place in this court over the years to come. But right now it is set for the first time in 15 years. There's a liberal majority on this Wisconsin's highest court. Back to you.
NBC's Shaq Brewster, thanks so much. Now, the scenes around China's capital right now are apocalyptic. When we come back, a report on the deadly flooding going on in Beijing. Stay tuned. And let's take a quick look around the world in 80 seconds. 4 Nigerian migrants survived 2 weeks at sea riding on a cargo ship's rudder. They were hoping to get to Europe, and it turns out they ended up all the way across the Atlantic in Brazil.
I thought I was going to Europe. And then, all of a sudden, I found myself here in Brazil.
It was a terrible experience for me. It's been the first time I've never tried that before.
Those men were on the water for 2 weeks. They ran out of food and fresh water on the 10th day, survived another 4 days drinking seawater. 2 of them have already been sent back to Nigeria at their request. The other 2 have applied for asylum in Brazil. And Moscow was hit by its second drone attack in 2 days. A drone broke through Russian air defenses and smashed into a high-rise there where some government agencies work. There's no immediate word on whether anyone was hurt. Kremlin is blaming Ukraine for the attacks, and President Vladimir Zelensky has not taken responsibility, but has seemed to suggest this is part of his strategy. Barrier Reef is no longer on the UN's list of World Heritage Sites being in danger, but it remains under serious threat from climate change, and it could once again fall back into danger status next year, especially if warm waters from El Nino spark another mass bleaching event. And torrential rains have caused a deadly flooding in China. At least 20 people died in Beijing and surrounding areas, and around the same number of people are missing right now. Some places reportedly got the same amount of rain they'd get in a month, but all in just 2 days. And NBC News foreign correspondent Janice Mackey-Frater is in China with more.
The rain has been relentless, and the image is gripping. Floodwaters rushing into more than a dozen districts of Beijing, trapping cars, stranding people. Rescuers using cables, pulleys, and lifeboats to get them to safety. A city of 22 million people inundated with torrents of water, from roads to rivers to airport runways. In the mountainous Montego district, more than 18 inches of rain in 48 hours and a flash flood forced the evacuation of 52,000 residents from their homes. There's never been such a severe flood, says this man, adding, "We hid at home and couldn't come out."
The water came heavy and it came fast with tons of mud and debris and nowhere to go.
Water, power, and communications lines have been down here since Monday.
The mud is really thick.
The water starting to recede and revealing the damage. This woman telling us, "I've never seen anything like it before." The downpours are the worst in a decade here, as the remnants of Typhoon Doksuri unleashed on northern China. According to officials, at least 20 people are dead in Beijing, and several are still missing. And warnings that another powerful storm is on the way. Janice Mackey-Frater, NBC News, Beijing.
Janice, thanks so much. And before we go, it is time for the future of everything. And it turns out some camps are ditching s'mores and sitting around the campfire for robots. We're going to explain. But first, Twitter is no more, and now apparently X is gone too. Well, just a logo there, that is. Elon Musk's newly named social media company X put a massive glowing sign on its San Francisco headquarters, but they didn't have the right permits, so it's already been taken down. People living nearby were also pretty annoyed with the sign because of its flashing light that was apparently too bright for even shades to block. The sign clearly wasn't that bright of an idea. We'll be right back. When most people think of summer camp, they think of the great outdoors, not programming AI, right? Well, that's what one group of high schoolers have been up to this summer at Princeton's AI for All camp. NBC's Morgan Radford has more in tonight's Future of Everything.
This is not your typical summer camp.
3, 2, 1, go.
Instead of roasting marshmallows, these high schoolers at Princeton University's AI for All camp are programming drones.
There it is.
Using artificial intelligence.
Stay there, stay there.
So what is this?
This is the drone simulation.
You all learned all of this just in the past 3 weeks.
Yes, we did.
It's incredible.
Here, they learn how robots move and think, and even teach drones how to map out areas on their own. So they can do things like monitor forest fires in places that humans can't reach.
We use satellite imagery to detect certain illegal mining activities.
It all started back in 2015 at Stanford University as a way to close the gender gap in the artificial intelligence field. Now it's designed to encourage women and students of color, reaching more than a dozen college and university campuses across the country last year.
There's a lot of fear around AI right now, and this is part of what's driving a lot of people away. They don't see role models that look like them. They don't have a peer support network within this field. And what we try to do is sort of address all of this. We try to demystify some of this technology and reduce some of the fear.
And in a data-driven industry, the data is striking. Job postings for generative AI have increased more than 540% in the last 3 years. But industry-wide, women make up just 30% of AI workers.
Do you see a lot of other women who look like you, who look like me? Do you see a lot of women of color?
Not a lot. I wish there was more.
And it's a field where people of color are dramatically underrepresented, a trend these students say they plan to break.
What would you say to other young women, other people of color who may be hesitant to learn about this space?
Don't be intimidated and be open-minded to learn new things.
To be curious?
Yes.
A new generation changing the technology that's changing the world.
Morgan Radford, thanks so much. That does it for us tonight. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you tomorrow. But until then, stay tuned now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.